The night began like any other. As a security guard, my job was to watch over the sprawling industrial warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for years, recently bought by some company for redevelopment. Until construction began, my job was to ensure no squatters, vandals, or thrill-seekers caused trouble. I liked the solitude. The vast silence of the warehouse was comforting in its own way, the perfect antidote to the chaos of city life. The night shift had its challenges, of course. The creaks and groans of an old building settling into itself could play tricks on your mind. But tonight, I felt oddly uneasy. The shift started at 10 p.m., the chill of the late autumn air making me pull my jacket tighter. The warehouse was massive, with 4 levels of storage rooms, old offices, and countless corridors. My routine was simple: patrol every hour, starting with the perimeter, then sweep the interior. At midnight, the first sign of something unusual happened. As I completed my perimeter check, my flashlight caught movement near the west fence. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to set my nerves on edge. I called out, "Who's there?" My voice echoed into the darkness. No answer. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight at the area. The fence stood intact, its rusted chain links casting jagged shadows on the ground. Perhaps it had been an animal. Shrugging it off, I continued my patrol. Inside the warehouse, the air felt heavier. The structure creaked more than usual, as if the walls themselves were straining against an unseen force. I made my way to the control room on the second floor to check the security monitors. The ancient system showed grainy black and white footage from various cameras. Nothing seemed out of place. By 1 a.m., I began my second sweep. The silence had become oppressive. As I walked through the main storage area, my flashlight beam caught something on the floor. A footprint. A fresh one, made in the thin layer of dust that blanketed the warehouse floor. My breath hitched. It wasn't mine, it was too large, and I hadn't been in this section since the start of my shift. I followed the prints. They led toward the old office block on the eastern side of the warehouse. The offices had been gutted years ago, leaving little more than hollow rooms and broken furniture. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct telling me to turn back. But duty compelled me forward. The first room was empty, save for some debris and a few toppled filing cabinets. The second was the same. In the third room, my flashlight beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. A makeshift bed, a dirty mattress surrounded by discarded food wrappers and empty water bottles. Someone had been living here. My radio crackled, startling me. "All clear?" the voice of my supervisor asked. I fumbled to respond. "Yeah, all clear." I didn't mention the discovery. Part of me didn't want to believe it was anything serious. Maybe a drifter had found shelter and moved on. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I left the office block, my heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the patrol was uneventful, though every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far, every sound seemed amplified. By the time I returned to the control room, it was nearly 2 a.m. I reviewed the camera footage again, this time focusing on the office block. Nothing. The feed showed empty corridors and rooms, still and silent. Then, as I prepared to move on, something caught my eye. A shadow flitted across the camera covering the main storage area. I rewound the footage, playing it back frame by frame. There it was, a human figure, moving quickly, just out of the camera's range. My hands trembled as I grabbed my flashlight and headed back out. This time, I moved more carefully, my steps deliberate and quiet. The main storage area felt different now, almost alive with anticipation. My flashlight swept across rows of rusted shelving and stacks of decaying crates. Nothing. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like metal against concrete. It came from the far end of the room. I followed the sound, every muscle in my body tense. As I rounded the corner, my flashlight illuminated a man crouched near a stack of crates. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a hood. He froze, his eyes locking onto mine. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he bolted, darting between the crates. I gave chase, my boots pounding against the concrete floor. He was fast, weaving through the maze-like storage area with practiced ease. I struggled to keep up, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. He led me back toward the office block. As I entered, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the corridors. I followed, my adrenaline fueling me. The chase ended in a small room at the far end of the block. The door was ajar, creaking on its hinges. I entered cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, or so it seemed. Then I noticed the vent cover on the far wall. It had been removed, the screws scattered on the floor. The man had escaped into the ventilation system. Frustration bubbled up inside me. I had no way of following him in there. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who promised to send additional security in the morning. Until then, I was alone. I returned to the control room, my nerves frayed. The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia. Every noise, every shadow seemed like a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still watching me, lurking just out of sight. When dawn finally broke, the relief crew arrived. I briefed them on the night's events and left the warehouse, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. I hoped the man wouldn't return, that he'd been scared off. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Over the next few nights, the pattern continued. Footprints in the dust, fleeting shadows on the cameras, and the occasional sound of movement. Each time I tried to catch him, he slipped away, always one step ahead. It was as if he knew the warehouse better than I did. Then, one night, everything escalated. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the scream. A blood-curdling sound that echoed through the warehouse, freezing me in place. I rushed toward the source, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The scream had come from the basement, a place I rarely ventured. The basement was a labyrinth of storage rooms and machinery, the air thick with the smell of mildew. As I descended the stairs, the sound of footsteps echoed above me. Someone was following me. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. No one was there. I continued, my heart hammering in my chest. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a trail of blood leading into one of the storage rooms. Swallowing my fear, I followed it. The room was empty, save for a large metal crate. The blood led directly to it. I approached cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the rusted surface. Before I could open it, I heard a sound behind me, the click of a knife being unsheathed. I turned slowly, my flashlight revealing the man from before. He stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a sinister grin. In his hand was a large hunting knife, its blade glinting in the light. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. My mind raced. There was no escape, no way to call for help. I tried to stall him, talking calmly, but he advanced steadily. Just as he lunged, I dodged, grabbing a rusted pipe from the floor. We fought, the confined space making every move critical. In the end, I managed to knock the knife from his hand and pin him down. He struggled, but I held on until the sound of sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived, alerted by my supervisor after I missed a scheduled check-in. The police arrested the man, who turned out to be a wanted fugitive. He'd been using the warehouse as a hideout, evading capture for months. As they led him away, he glared at me, his eyes full of hatred. That was my last night at the warehouse. I quit the next day, unable to face the memories of what had happened. Even now, I can't shake the image of his face, the sound of his voice. I tell myself it's over, that he's locked away. But in the dark corners of my mind, I wonder if he'll ever come back. The night began like any other. I had just started my shift at the lone security booth overlooking the isolated parking structure on the edge of town. This wasn't just any parking structure, it was the site of a decades-old controversy. The building had been half demolished years ago, a project abandoned midway, leaving a skeletal maze of concrete and rebar that the city never got around to finishing. My job was to ensure it remained off-limits to trespassers. The solitude wasn't new to me. I'd worked this post for months, getting used to the rhythmic hum of crickets and the occasional distant howl of a stray dog. The wind often swept through the structure, producing eerie, hollow sounds that could send chills down anyone's spine. But tonight, the wind seemed different, heavier somehow. The kind of weight that settles in your chest when you know something isn't quite right. My shift officially started at 10 p.m., and the first few hours were uneventful. At midnight, I performed my usual patrol. I walked the perimeter of the structure, shining my flashlight into the shadows. The unfinished parking lot's upper levels loomed above me like a giant skeleton. As I moved, I noticed something odd, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from inside. Stopping in my tracks, I turned off my flashlight to let my eyes adjust to the dark. The tapping continued. It was too steady to be a dripping pipe and too deliberate to be the wind. I turned the flashlight back on, the beams slicing through the gloom. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice echoing into the cold night. No response. Deciding to investigate, I followed the sound toward the ramp leading to the second level. The higher I went, the louder the tapping became. By the time I reached the second level, it stopped entirely. The sudden silence was unnerving. I swept my flashlight across the open space. The skeletal walls cast long, jagged shadows, but nothing seemed out of place. I shook my head, muttering to myself about overactive imaginations, and headed back to the booth. The hours dragged on, and I busied myself with the radio and security logs. Around 2 a.m., I caught movement on one of the security cameras. A figure darted across the screen, too fast for me to make out any details. My stomach sank. It wasn't uncommon for local teens to dare each other into exploring the structure, but something about this felt off. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way back into the parking structure. The air was colder now, biting against my exposed skin. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing against the concrete. The second level was empty, just as before, but I noticed something new, a single, fresh footprint in a patch of dirt near the center of the floor. The footprint was large, and the tread pattern was distinct, like a heavy boot. I crouched to inspect it when I heard it again, the tapping sound. This time, it was closer. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned toward the source. The sound was coming from the ramp leading to the third level. Slowly, I ascended, my flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the third level, I froze. Standing near the edge of the structure was a man, his back turned to me. He was dressed in dark clothes, a hood pulled over his head. He didn't move, didn't even flinch as my flashlight beam landed on him. "Hey! This area's off limits. You need to leave now," I said, my voice more confident than I felt. He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly tilted his head, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. It was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes glinted in the dim light. Then, without warning, he bolted. "Stop!" I shouted, giving chase. The man sprinted toward the far end of the structure, weaving through the concrete pillars. I struggled to keep up, the maze-like layout making it difficult to track him. Just as I thought I'd lost him, I spotted him slipping through a narrow gap in the wall that led to the stairwell. I followed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The stairwell was dark, the faint smell of damp concrete filling the air. I could hear his footsteps echoing above me, growing fainter as he ascended. By the time I reached the top level, he was gone. I scanned the open space, but there was no sign of him. Only the wind remained, howling through the exposed beams. Feeling defeated, I made my way back down. As I descended, I noticed something chilling, a message scrawled on the wall in what looked like black marker. "You shouldn't have come here." The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. When my shift finally ended, I reported the incident to my supervisor. He promised to install additional cameras and said he'd notify the authorities, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. The next night, I returned reluctantly. My supervisor had replaced the broken cameras, but the sense of unease remained. Around 1 a.m., the tapping sound returned. This time, it was coming from the ground level. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried toward the source. The sound led me to a storage room near the base of the structure. The door was ajar, creaking softly as it swayed in the breeze. Inside, the room was empty except for a pile of old tools and debris. But something caught my eye, a notebook lying on the floor. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. Most of it was filled with erratic scribbles and strange symbols, but one page stood out. It simply read, "He's always watching." A chill ran down my spine. I decided I'd had enough. I returned to the booth and called my supervisor, insisting he send someone to relieve me. While I waited, I reviewed the security footage. At first, everything seemed normal. Then, on one of the cameras, I saw him. The man was standing just outside the booth, staring directly into the lens. I whipped around, my flashlight darting to the windows. He was gone. The police arrived shortly after. They searched the structure but found no sign of the man. They dismissed it as a prank, saying the notebook was probably left by a group of trespassers. But I knew better. Whoever he wasn't just passing through. I quit the job the next morning. I couldn't stay there, not after what I'd seen. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear it, that faint, rhythmic tapping, echoing in the distance. The beginning of my shift started like any other, mundane and quiet, but something felt off the moment I stepped into the security booth. The parking structure I was guarding was abandoned years ago, its construction halted midway due to financial troubles. Now, it stood like a skeleton, a concrete shell with jagged rebar reaching into the sky. My job was to keep trespassers out, a duty that seemed more symbolic than necessary. The booth was cold that night, colder than usual. A small space heater struggled to push back the chill that seeped in through the thin glass windows. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the thermos I brought, the steam rising like a ghostly tendril in the dim light. Outside, the wind howled through the open levels of the parking structure, producing an almost musical whistling sound that seemed to follow its own eerie rhythm. By 11 p.m., I settled into my routine, scanning the cameras, logging the uneventful hours, and occasionally stepping out to stretch my legs. The parking structure's shadowy silhouette loomed in the distance, its incomplete ramps and pillars looking like the bones of a giant long-forgotten beast. At midnight I heard it for the first time, a faint clinking sound, like metal striking concrete. I paused, my pen hovering over the logbook. The sound came again, this time louder. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside into the biting cold. The sound echoed, making it hard to pinpoint its origin. "Anyone there?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the wind. There was no reply. I walked toward the structure, the gravel crunching under my boots. The sound seemed to retreat as I approached, leading me up the first ramp. The beam of my flashlight danced over the barren concrete floor, revealing nothing but scattered debris. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, a single wrench lying in the middle of the floor, its metal surface gleaming faintly under the light. My brow furrowed. Tools were rarely left behind here, and I'd never seen one before during my patrols. Shrugging it off as an oversight, I placed the wrench in my pocket and continued my patrol. But as I descended back to the ground level, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt charged, heavy with an unspoken tension. Back in the booth, I reviewed the security footage. The cameras were old and grainy, but they covered most of the structure's levels. As I fast-forwarded through the last hour, I caught a glimpse of movement. Rewinding, I leaned closer to the monitor. There, on the second level, was a figure, a man walking purposefully through the shadows. My breath hitched. No one was supposed to be here. Grabbing my radio and flashlight, I headed back out, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I reached the second level quickly, my boots echoing against the concrete. "This is private property," I called out, my voice firm. "You need to leave immediately." Silence. The only sound was the wind, which seemed to mock me as it whistled through the open structure. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Then I saw it, another tool, this time a hammer, lying near a column. My stomach churned. Someone was here, and they were leaving these deliberately. I backed away, deciding it was best to return to the booth and call for backup. As I turned, I heard it again, the clinking sound, now much closer. Spinning around, I caught a glimpse of movement at the far end of the level. A shadowy figure darted behind a pillar. "Stop right there!" I shouted, giving chase. The figure was fast, weaving through the columns with an agility that caught me off guard. My flashlight struggled to keep up, its beam bouncing wildly as I ran. The chase led me to the stairwell, where I caught sight of the man's silhouette disappearing up the stairs. By the time I reached the top level, my lungs burned, and my pulse hammered in my ears. The space was eerily empty, the city lights in the distance casting a faint glow over the unfinished concrete. I swept my flashlight across the area, but the man was gone. In his place was another message, words scrawled in chalk on the floor. "Why do you follow?" I stepped back, my heart racing. This wasn't just some prank, it felt personal, targeted. Swallowing my fear, I descended back to the booth and locked the door. My hands trembled as I called my supervisor, explaining the situation. He promised to send someone to check on me, but it would take at least an hour. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I couldn't sit still, pacing the small booth and glancing nervously at the monitors. Every creak and groan of the structure outside felt amplified, each shadow a potential threat. When my relief finally arrived, I practically ran to my car, eager to put the night behind me. The next day, I debated not returning. But something about the encounter nagged at me. I needed answers. That evening, I arrived early, determined to confront whatever, or whoever, was toying with me. I brought a camera, intending to document any evidence. The first few hours were uneventful. I patrolled the structure meticulously, checking every corner. But by midnight, the familiar clinking sound returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I followed it to the third level, where I found a small pile of tools arranged in a circle. At the center was a piece of paper. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "Leave now." My hands shook as I picked up the note. The air around me felt charged, as if the building itself was alive and breathing. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. Spinning around, I caught sight of the man, tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a hood. He stood motionless, watching me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, then another. I backed away, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "Stay back!" I shouted. He lunged. I turned and ran, my heart pounding as I sprinted down the ramps. Behind me, his footsteps echoed, relentless and unyielding. I barely made it back to the booth, slamming the door shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I fumbled for my phone to call the police. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. They searched the structure thoroughly, finding no trace of him except for the tools and the ominous note. The officers dismissed it as a trespasser playing games, but I knew better. This was no ordinary intruder. I quit the job the next morning, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Weeks later, I heard rumors of other guards experiencing similar encounters. The structure remains abandoned, a silent monument to unfinished business, both for the city and for the man who haunts its shadows. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But every so often, late at night, I hear the faint clinking of metal and wonder if he's still out there, waiting. Hey everyone, thank you so much for supporting this channel. It truly means a lot. As a broke college student editing all my videos on an Android phone, It takes a lot of effort to bring these stories to life. A laptop would help me create better content faster, so if you enjoy my work, please subscribe and share. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you so much.